in our Franciscan series, so a big welcome to all of you. It's lovely to have people I haven't seen before, and I suspect there may be a fair door with Franciscan tertiaries here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Sister Francisca, very appropriate name, who's kicking off the series. She's, if I may just read something about your academic background. She entered the Academy called Clare in York, turned her attention to other things, and eventually obtained a master's degree in Celtic Christianity, and then a doctorate in historical theology, which I believe was also Celtic, yes. You've done research on Irish martyrologies, and her particular area of expertise is liturgy and its relationship to time. Also early monasticism. I could go on, but I shan't. So we have a very learned lady here. And she's going to talk about Francis and Clare. So without further ado.
I'd like first of all to thank Georgia very much for the invitation to come. I'm always pleased to come to Oxford because the family have close connections with Oxford, and my uncle was at university here. And to talk about the founder of the religious family that I belong to, which obviously is one of my very favourite subjects. This is intended to be a kind of introduction to the whole series. I think Francis is a saint that everybody knows something about. Everybody knows some of the stories about St. Francis. So in this presentation, what I'm trying to do is really join up the dots so that we see how it all fits together, and then maybe fill in a bit of the background. Because Francis and Clare lived in a world that was in some ways remarkably similar to the world we live in, but in a lot of other ways was very, very different. And we have to be careful not to read back 800 years our present situation, either our church situation or the situation of secular society. They lived in a very, very different world. And I hope to show in this presentation something of what that world was like, something of what they were like as people, not as plaster saints upon a pedestal, but as real people who often had to struggle both with themselves and with their circumstances, with the church and with people around about them, and to make them just come alive a little bit and to show what we can learn from them today. So, as you know, Francesco was a nickname. He was actually christened John. His father was away in France on a trading trip because he was a merchant in material and cloth. He was becoming a very wealthy merchant, and when his first son was born, he wasn't at home. His mother, Pica, who was French, had him christened John, but when the father came home and Pietro came home, he said, "No, he's my little Frenchman," so he called him Francesco. And Francis always had a great love of everything French, partly I think because of his mother. She taught him a smattering of French, which he didn't speak very well, but he spoke it when he was really excited, when he was really enthusiastic about something. Francis spoke in French. He loved the French troubadour songs that he'd also picked up from his mother. France was always very special to him. And then Chiara di Faverone di Fiducio, a woman from a different strata of society altogether. And remember, we're back in a world where your place in society was terribly important. And if you were born into a particular social level, there was no way you could move out of it. Chiara came from the nobility, from the higher ranks of society. Her father was called Favarone, her grandfather was called Offreduccio, and her grandfather particularly was a very important person in Assisi society. This is the world in which they lived, and we are concentrating on this little bit here, round about Assisi, north central Italy, in the late 12th, early to middle 13th century. I'm sure some of you have been to Assisi. This will be a familiar sight. This obviously is present day Italy. But still the landscape will be pretty similar. A land of mountains and forests, vineyards, olive groves. That slide was actually taken from the piazza outside the Basilica of Santa Chiara, looking down over the olive groves on land which would have belonged to Clare's family in her lifetime. And the sunflowers. Everywhere you go, sunflowers. So first of all, their political world. Medieval Italy was divided into little city-states. Some of these were loyal to the Roman Emperor, they were the Ghibellines, and some were loyal to the Pope, they were the Guelphs. And there was constant conflict between them. Even the architecture of the buildings, it showed where the allegiance of that city was. Which, if you think about it, was very important. If you were travelling, you didn't have any maps, you saw a city on the horizon, you wanted to stay there for the night, but would they accept you if they supported the opposite party? So you had your eye on those crenellations. If they were square ones, that meant the city supported the Pope. If they were those swallowtail ones, then they supported the emperor. And you picked according to your own allegiance. Assisi was always supporting the emperor, but the neighbouring city of Perugia supported the Pope, and there was constant conflict between the two. Assisi stands on the lower slopes of Monte Subasio. Now in Francis' time, of course, this huge complex all along here didn't exist, because that was built in his honour, and what he would have thought about it is something else altogether. So if we imagine this little bit here, probably even smaller, was the Assisi of his day. And that is the first site that you have of Assisi as you come in along the motorway from Perugia. Even today, the Rocca Maggiore, it still stands sentinel over the town. For the common people, the ordinary people, the minores, the people that didn't really matter very much. This was the symbol of hated feudal nobility. Closer. And in 1197, the minores rebelled against the maiores, the big people, the important people. And the ruling class, the maiores, were forced to flee from the town and to take refuge in Perugia. These are just one or two slides. I mean, those of you who've been there, you'll be quite familiar with these. Here, there's what was originally a pagan temple. You can see there the swallowtail crenellations which show Assisi's allegiance. Street scenes in Assisi that have changed very little since Francis' time. When I showed this once before, they said, cars are a bit different now. So Clare's family was one of the nobility who had to escape for their lives to Perugia, knowing that their palaces had been burnt behind them. Francis, the merchant's son, and Clare, the nobleman's daughter, were on opposite sides of this great social divide. So it's interesting that Clare, as a little child, knew what it was to be a refugee, to have to run away from home for her life. The slides, half a dozen slides which follow, they were taken during a fiesta, the Calenda Mayo, which happens in the first week of May, when today Assisi dresses up in medieval costume and it tries to recreate something of the atmosphere of this medieval world. They show our interpretation of what we think medieval life was like. There's colour and there's flamboyance and the sun's shining and everybody's happy. But they don't convey other aspects of medieval society. There was harshness, there was squalor, there was disease, there was terrible disease, there was dreadful poverty, a great deal of superstition, oppression, cruelty. This is what the ordinary people had to endure. And in the lives of Francis and Clare, we see all of this, both good and bad. So this is the 21st century pretending to be the 13th century. If you look very closely, those suction shoes say mother care as loudly as can be. Maybe they give us just a little idea of what things look like on good days. And there is an American tourist as large as life. 2 years ago, my own community was very privileged to go to Assisi on pilgrimage. We went in 2 parties, and the priest that was leading one of the parties, he said to the pilgrims, "Look at the faces of the people in Assisi, because they are the descendants, not the direct linear descendants, but they're the descendants of the families that were there in the time of Francis and Clare." So I like to think, it's probably a bit fanciful, but I like to think that that could be Clare and her sister Agnes. And then their economic world, which was at a time of great turmoil, really. That is Pietro and Pica Bernardone, parents of St. Francis. They were part of a world, it was rapidly changing from this two-tier feudal society, where you had the mayores, the important people, the big people who got things done, and then the minores, the little people, the unimportant people, the poor people, the people that did all the hard work. So it's changing from that kind of society into a market economy. A middle class is developing, of traders, entrepreneurs. They're becoming more and more powerful, more and more influential. Pietro Bernardone was one of these. You see he's got a bolt of cloth over his arm because he was a cloth merchant, and that was how he was making a great deal of money. When people see this, they say, well, what's his mother holding that chain for? His mother is holding that chain because, for reasons which we'll see in a little while, Pietro was very, very annoyed, furious with Francis. And he went so far as to actually lock him up in his own house. We're back in the days when the father of the family had complete say over what happened to his children, even the power of life and death. Well, Pietro didn't go quite that far, but he locked Francis up. And Pica, who was much more sensitive to Francis and much more sympathetic to what he was trying to do, waited till the father had gone off on another trading trip and let Francis out. So that's why she's holding those chains in her hand. That statue stands outside the Chiesa Nuova, which tradition says is built on the site of the Bernardone home and shop. There he is again. He was a hard-headed businessman. He was making lots and lots of money in the cloth trade, and he expected his elder son, Francesco, to follow him. We're at the time of the Crusades, which we know terrible things happened. We're still living with the results. But it wasn't all bad. The Crusades had opened up the path to the east for trade of goods and the exchange of knowledge. When you think the alphabet that we use today, it's the Roman alphabet, but our figures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, are Arabic figures, and that is the result, one of the results of some of this exchange of knowledge that was happening at this time. So Pietro travelled far and wide to buy and sell beautiful material. These gorgeous silks that were coming in from the east, particularly from China. People now had money, they could buy these things, and they wanted beautiful clothes. But Francis was the original good time boy. He was much more interested in spending his father's money than in helping to make it. He liked having good clothes, he liked having a good horse to ride, and he just loved having fun. He loved, as I said, he loved the troubadour songs. He liked to play and to sing. He was the acknowledged leader of the youth of the town. He was the life and soul of every party. Later, biographers try and smooth over this and say, well, he was always very kind and he was always very thoughtful, but they were really making the best of a bad job. Francis was the leader of the jobbers of Assisi. If you saw him coming with his cronies, you'd have crossed over onto the other side of the road if you valued your life. Francis wanted to be famous. He wanted to be a knight. And he dreamt of great deeds in battle and high honours. Assisi was involved in yet another battle with Perugia, and Francis got his father to set him up as a knight, which was a very expensive business, and he rode out to fight in the battle. He saw dreadful, dreadful things. He saw some of his close friends being slain in horrible ways on the battlefield. He himself was captured. He spent a year as a prisoner of war. In the end, his father ransomed him, again for a massive amount, and he came home. He was sick for a long time. He seems to have had some kind of a breakdown, probably as a result of the horrible things he'd seen on the battlefield. But he was completely taken up with ideas of high honours as a knight, and he got his father to set him up yet again, and off he went to fight. But the very first night away from home, he had a dream. And in this dream, he saw a great hall full of all the weapons and the panoply of war. And a voice said to him, "Francis, which would you rather do? Follow the master or the servant?" And he said, "Well, the master, of course." And the voice said, "Then why are you following the servant?" And when he woke up, he was so confused that he went back home. He'd been told, "You will be shown what you are to do." So then, of course, he was in trouble with his townsfolk as a deserter from the army, and he spent a lot of time just on his own, either walking or riding in the fields and the woods round about Assisi. And one day, when he was out on horseback, he met a leper. And as you know, throughout human history, lepers have been feared and they've been hated. In the Middle Ages, leprosy was believed to be caused by sexual contact, so they were also despised as being immoral. They were sent to live, there was an actual ritual for lepers to be sent away to live right apart from human habitation. And Francis was an extremely fastidious young man. The Middle Ages are not renowned for their hygiene standards, but Francis was very fastidious. He was repulsed by the sight of lepers, he hated the stench. If ever he got anywhere near lepers, he held his nose, but he preferred to just run, to turn tail and run. But this time, this particular leper moved him somehow. He was overcome with pity for this poor man. He got off his horse, he embraced the leper, and he kissed him. And then he got back on his horse, and he rode on, and when he looked back over his shoulder, the leper had disappeared. And for the rest of his life, Francis believed that that leper was Christ in disguise. We once had a series of talks from a Franciscan friar, and he said, who founded the Franciscan family? So Francis? No. Made other suggestions. No. What were they? The Franciscan family was founded by a leper, he said. And it certainly was a turning point in Francis' life. At the end of his life, he wrote, the Lord gave me such faith in churches that I would simply pray and speak in this way. We adore you, O most holy Lord Jesus Christ, in all your churches throughout the world, and we bless you, because by your holy cross you have redeemed the world. And it's still a Franciscan custom to say that prayer whenever we go into a church. As I say, it was a turning point in his life. From this time onwards, he wasn't interested in revels and having a good time and partying. He wasn't even as interested in being a knight. He began to spend more and more time alone and in prayer. One day, he was in this little ruined church outside the town. He was praying when the figure on the crucifix spoke to Francis. Said, Francis, go, repair my church, which as you see is falling into ruins. Francis is one of these impulsive people that he raced off to do things without an awful lot of thought. And he assumed that the Lord meant church buildings. So he went off and he tried to rebuild little ruined churches in the woods round about Assisi, of which there were several. He ran out of funds, so he helped himself to a bale of his father's best cloth. He took it off to market in Foligno, and he sold it. Not only the cloth, he sold the horse as well. When his father found out, he was absolutely livid. He dragged Francis into the public square before the bishop, and he accused him of stealing. Well, Francis was really hurt because he felt his father didn't understand this message that he'd been given straight from God. So he gave back the money, and he even took off the clothes he was wearing. And he said, from now on, Pietro Bernardone is no longer my father. My father is in heaven. And the bishop, as you see at the side here, the bishop put his own cloak around Francis, partly to restore his modesty. There's the whole of Assisi here goggling a naked young man, and partly to show that from now on, Francis is under the jurisdiction of the church. As far as we know, Francis and his father were never reconciled, which is very sad. But I think before we condemn Pietro, we have to look at it from his point of view. Twice he had spent a great deal of money setting his son up as a knight. He'd ransomed him as a prisoner of war, which probably cost him even more money. He's expecting his elder son to follow him in the business, and here he is doing what to Pietro looks like absolutely ridiculous things. And Francis, of course, is just so hurt because he feels his father doesn't understand. So we've got two very well-meaning people who just are unable to understand each other. Even his former friends thought he'd just lost use of his senses. He claimed that he'd fallen in love with a beautiful lady, the lady Holy Poverty. And here we see a fresco where you've got Francis here being betrothed to the Lady Poverty by Christ. And there is a very early Franciscan text called the Sacrum Commercium, the holy exchange between Francis and the Lady Poverty, which is the basis for a great deal of Franciscan spirituality. Francis was the son of a merchant, and for merchants, wealth meant money, hard cash. Poverty meant not having money, and Francis always saw money as tainted. Later on, when he was writing a rule for his brothers in 1221, he would say very emphatically, none of the brothers, wherever he may be, wherever he goes, should in any way carry, receive, or have received by others either money or coins. Francis hated money. The Bernardone family belonged to this new merchant class. Wealth meant money, and if you had money, you had power and the ability to control other people. If you shunned money, you didn't have money, it meant you were needy, you were in physical want, but it also meant that you were powerless, you were vulnerable, you were helpless, you didn't have influence, you didn't have status. So the Franciscan vision of poverty was to a large extent a reaction against the strong social currents of the time, and we see them exemplified in Francis and in his father Pietro. I'll go on to say in a little while that Francis wasn't the only person who was thinking like this. At this time, people were just beginning to read the gospel for themselves. And what they read in the gospel didn't tie up with what they saw happening in the church around them. And a lot of them were reacting against the pomp and the ceremony and the riches and saying they wanted to be poor. Francis was only one of several of these groups. Some of them stayed within the church. Some of them actually moved outside the church and actually ended up in heresy. So there was a lot of turmoil at this time. People were beginning to question all kinds of things. A nobleman in the town, Bernard of Quintavalle, he'd heard about Francis. Well, they'd all heard about Francis by this time. He was very curious to see him. So he asked Francis to come and stay with him, to spend the night. They had a meal, and then they went to bed. There's Bernard lying in bed, pretending to be asleep. Here's Francis, who's been to bed and then got up and spends the night in prayer. Bernard is, who I say is pretending to be asleep, but actually watching Francis. He is so impressed by this that he asks to join him. So the next day, they go to the church of San Nicolo, and Francis actually, here he's opening the gospel himself, but he actually asked the priest to open the gospel, and 3 times it came to passages about poverty. And Francis said, that's what I want. That's what I want with all my heart. And he says to Bernard, you have to go and sell all your goods and give the money to the poor, which Bernard very obediently did, stood on the steps of the cathedral and threw the money out, and of course the poor people all began to look. This was wonderful. Bernard was the first of many. Francis found a hut outside the town of Assisi at a place called Rivo Torto, the bend in the river. and he, with this little band of followers, moved in. That's a reconstruction of this hut, which you can see now has a big basilica built over it. This is kind of let down into the floor. It's not the original, but presumably very similar. And they lived there. They were so squashed that Francis had to chalk up a cross for each wall, and that was the spot where he slept and where he prayed. And they lived there for a few weeks, a few months. But eventually the man who owned this hut turned up, and he turned them out. He wanted to stable his donkey there. So he shooed them out, and they moved on to a little church of the Portiuncula, which is there. That's the little, it's only a little chapel. And they built a hut for each of the brothers. And this etching is much later, and I'm quite certain it wasn't all neat and tidy like this. But you get the idea. They each had their own little hut. That was the church where they prayed, and behind it there is the little infirmary hut for when they were ill. That little church, that little chapel, it still stands today. Now it's completely encased within a huge Baroque basilica. Francis loved this little tiny church more than anywhere else in the world, and he said to the brothers, if ever they drive you out of the Portiuncula, the little church, the little portion, they drive you out of the door, you must come back in through the window, but you must never leave the Portiuncula. Which is quite amazing for somebody who preached poverty, detachment, non-appropriation. This is our church, and you must never leave it. More and more brothers came to join Francis. Now, he never intended to found an order. It was simply the conversion of one individual to follow Christ, to live out the gospel more fully, more generously. But because of this enormously attractive personality that he had, people wanted to be with him. They wanted to join him. So Francis wrote a very simple rule of life, which was really just passages from the gospel strung together. And he was very anxious that they should have the Pope's approval. So they all went off to Rome to ask the Pope's blessing. Now, as I was just saying, round about this time, there were many groups of people who were doing similar things. They were trying to live according to radical gospel ideals. Some of these, like the Waldenses, rejected the church and church teaching. So the cardinals who were advising the Pope urged him to be very cautious about Francis and this band of ragged brothers. They could be heretics in the making. However, the Pope had had a dream in which he saw a little man in a shabby habit holding up the tottering church. Here you see the Pope in bed with his mitre on, and here is Francis propping up the church. He recognised Francis as this little man. But I have, in all honesty, to tell you that the Dominicans tell exactly the same story about St. Dominic. Anyway, the Pope recognised Francis, and so he gave his blessing to the brothers and their new rule of life. Francis had one desire, that was to live the gospel more fully and to tell the whole of creation how much they were loved by God. He'd had this overwhelming experience himself. He wanted everybody to share it. And he even preached to the birds. That's, as you know, a very famous fresco in Giotto. The story goes that he tamed a wolf that had been terrorising the neighbourhood, the village of Gubbio, and he converted the wolf. This is in the realm of legend, but it's one of the best known ones. More than anything else, Francis wanted the gospel to be preached in whatever way it could be done. And he told the brothers, use words if necessary, In other words, it's your example more than anything else that's going to preach the gospel. But if it's necessary, then use words. He himself wrote letters. He wrote letters to his brothers. He wrote letters to the ministers of the order. He wrote letters to all the faithful. He was a great letter writer, was Francis. We still have the letter that he wrote to Brother Leo when Leo was struggling with temptation and he needed Francis' help. That's where we have St. Francis' blessing, which he took straight from the book of Numbers. May the Lord bless you, may he show his face to you, may he turn his countenance to you, may the Lord be gracious to you, Brother Leo. And it's signed with the cross, with the tau sign that Francis made his own. He sent his brothers out 2 by 2, because that was what Jesus had done in the Gospel. Jesus sent the disciples out 2 by 2, so Francis does what Jesus did. And there we've got the friars crossing the Channel to come to England. Much later, the friars in North America, the friars in South America, and even today, the friars going out 2 by 2. Francis, he repressed all his own needs, both physical and psychological, but he was always very sensitive to the needs of others. And he realised that brothers going out like this needed a companion. They needed someone. First of all, they needed somebody to pray with, because Francis was very adamant that they must pray the divine office, the prayer of the church at the appropriate times. So they needed a brother to pray with, and also someone to share the joys and the sorrows of missionary work with. So the brothers went out 2 by 2. And this time they went out, well, it was 6 actually, but one of them fell ill, and 5 of them went on to Morocco, where they were martyred. They were the first martyrs of the order. This is one of the areas in which there's quite a lot of research being done at the moment. What was Francis' attitude towards Islam, towards the Crusades? Because these 5 friars who were martyred in Morocco more or less asked for martyrdom. When we read the contemporary account, which we have in their office for Matins on their feast day, actually the Muslims were extremely patient towards them, and they insulted the Quran, and they insulted the Muslims because they were so anxious. They wanted to give their lives for Christ. And the big question is, was this really the way Francis wanted it done? Because shortly after this, when Francis himself went amongst the Muslims in Egypt, Damietta, his approach was completely different. He wanted to talk to the Sultan. He wanted to tell him about Jesus. Of course he wanted him to be converted, but he didn't do it in a way that degraded the Sultan's own beliefs. So I said there's a lot of work being done on this at the moment. But when Francis heard that 5 of his friars had been martyred, he said, now I have 5 true friars minor. The news reached Europe, and it inspired a young man who was at the time a canon of St. Augustine, and it inspired him to ask to leave his own religious order and to join the Franciscans, because he wanted to be martyred too. His name was Anthony. He became famous not as a martyr but as a preacher, and we know him today as St. Anthony of Padua. It was all part of these preaching missions that the Franciscans brought prayer and devotion out of the monastic choir and into the marketplace. They were always on the move, so they themselves couldn't sing the long, complicated monastic offices. They encouraged the people with much simpler devotional prayer, like the Rosary, the Angelus, the Stations of the Cross. They didn't need books, they didn't take up long hours, but they made the life of Christ come alive for these people. This is supposed to be the great gift of the early Franciscans to the medieval church. And now we'll leave Francis just for a little while and we'll meet Clare. Clare was born, as I say, into one of the ruling families of Assisi. There were 7 knights in her household. Most of them were her uncles. She grew up a devout and kind and gentle girl, but she was also a very determined young lady, very strong-minded, and she wanted more out of life than what was accepted for women of her social status. At that time, a girl, once she reached marriageable age, she was kept completely separate. She wasn't allowed out. A political marriage was made for her by her parents, and then she was expected to bear many children to produce heirs to the family lands and titles. But that was not what Clare wanted. Clare had heard about Francis, so had the whole of Assisi, and she wanted to meet him. She had to do this in secret, accompanied by a chaperone, because her parents would never ever have allowed a teenage girl out on her own. She found that Francis' ideals were the same as her own. She wanted to join him and the brothers in their life of gospel poverty and simplicity. They made a plan. It came to Palm Sunday in the year 1212, and when the young women of the town went up to receive their palm from the bishop as part of the Palm Sunday ceremonial, Clare didn't go, she remained in her place. Some people thought she was either too shy or she was too wrapped in prayer, but people now wonder the fact that the bishop actually came down into the church to give her her palm. Was this the sign that the bishop was saying, yes, I know your plan, go ahead, I give you my blessing? That night, accompanied by this same trusted friend, she dressed in all her finery and all her jewels in one of these dramatic gestures that the early Franciscans loved so much. Whatever they did with great panache and great drama. So here's Clare running away from home, dressed as a bride, and she couldn't go out through the front door of her palazzo because it was guarded. There was a little used door at the side that was kept bolted and barred, and this was called the door of the dead, and it was the door through which a corpse was carried out when one of the family had died. And very symbolically, Clare left her home through the door of the dead. In other words, she was dying to everything that her family and her background could have offered her. She was also killing off, in a way that it's almost impossible for us to understand. She was killing off her own reputation and her family's reputation. As I say, it's almost impossible for us to understand just what a dreadful thing she had done to her family. Since then, it's all been wrapped up in very pious language. She wanted to give herself to Jesus. She wanted to be betrothed to Jesus. Well, she did. But she also dragged her family's reputation right down into the mud. I think the nearest we have in our own world is the honour killings that we see in Muslim society, when a young Muslim girl has apparently let her family down very badly. Her father, uncles, elder brother feel that it's perfectly acceptable to actually put her to death because she has ruined her family's honour. That is what Clare of Assisi did to her family, and she knew what she was doing. She went out to the Church of the Portiuncula, which is a couple of miles outside Assisi, down on the plain. Francis and the brothers were waiting for her. They had lighted candles. Francis gave her a rough habit like his own, a rope around her waist, and he cut off her hair to show that she had dedicated her life to God and that she is now under the jurisdiction of the Church. He took her to the Benedictine monastery of San Paolo to be a nun, to be one of the community. He took her there and she worked in the kitchen as a scullery maid. This young noble girl had probably never washed a plate in her life. And the fact that this happened on Palm Sunday wasn't a coincidence. It was all part of this Franciscan drama. She spent Holy Week when Jesus was suffering and dying for us. She spent Holy Week sharing in his degradation, in his humiliation. She was in the kitchens of the Benedictine monastery as a skivvy. Her uncles now realised where she was, that she'd run away from home, and as I say, the honour of the family was at stake, and so they came to drag her back. She clung to the altar, she claimed the right of sanctuary, and when they still tried to drag her away, she pulled her veil off, she showed her shorn hair, that she is now under church jurisdiction. So they realised that they couldn't touch her. She had a younger sister called Catherine, who was only 15. Catherine wanted to be with Clare, and 2 weeks later she ran away to join her. The uncles came in hot pursuit, and they tried to drag Catherine home. But here, this is a fresco that was painted not long after the lifetime of St. Clare. It's almost contemporary. Clare is praying, the uncles are trying to drag Catherine away. They leave her half dead. In fact, they thought she was dead. As I say, the honour of the family was so much at stake, even to kill this girl would have been quite acceptable. But Clare came, picked her up. Later, she made her vows into Clare's hands, just as we make our vows into the hands of our abbess today. Francis is there and is cutting off her hair, and he gives her the name Agnes. So now there are two of them. And Francis takes them to the little church, one of the churches that he himself rebuilt, the Church of San Damiano. Clare wrote later in her life, "We went to dwell in the church of San Damiano." The choir, where the sisters prayed the divine office by day, by night. Around about this time, there were lots of groups of devout women in Europe. They're called beguines. They served the poor, they did good works, they lived lives of prayer and fasting. But the church wasn't too happy about them, partly because they kept control of their own finances, partly because they were women and they were on the fringe of the church's authority. The Pope, Innocent III, he convened the Fourth Lateran Council, which was the most important ecumenical council of the Middle Ages. It was the equivalent of Vatican II in its own day. It was held in the splendour of the Lateran Palace in Rome, and amidst all this splendour, all these patriarchs and bishops and abbots and priors, there's a little man in a tatty brown habit. Francis is there following all that's going on, and he goes home to tell Clare all about it. One of the things that the council decreed was that any new religious order must adopt an already existing rule. So the Pope gave Clare a rule based on that of St. Benedict, but that wasn't what she wanted. She wanted the privilege of poverty, the privilege of having no privileges. That's what Francis had for the brothers, that's what she wanted for the sisters. She had to fight to the end of her life for this. The Crusades, when horrible atrocities were committed in the name of Christ. But now Francis had a completely different idea. He didn't want to fight the Muslims. He wanted to go and speak to the Sultan and tell him what Christianity was all about. And the story goes that the Sultan listened and he respected Francis, gave him gifts. But when Francis came back to Italy, things had changed. While he was away, others had taken over the order. They didn't share his views on poverty and simplicity. So he went to another little friary, the one in Fonte Colombo, and he tried to write another version of the rule, because they said to him, oh yeah, the rule that you wrote, well, we can't find it, and we seem to have lost it. So they said, all right, I will write another one. That's the little chapel of St. Mary Magdalene, Fonte Colombo, where Brother Leo used to say Mass for Francis. His eyes had become infected and inflamed while he was in the Middle East. Eye infections were very, very common. And the barbaric surgery of the day decreed that his eyes had to be cauterized with red-hot irons. That's the actual room where it was done. All his brothers ran away. They couldn't bear to see Francis suffer. Francis himself was frightened. He prayed to Brother Fire, and he asked Brother Fire not to hurt him. He said afterwards he didn't feel any pain, but from then on he was almost blind. He had a friend called Giovanni in the village of Greccio, which is right tucked away high in the mountains, and he asked Giovanni to prepare a cave and an ox and an ass to show the people what the first Christmas would really have been like. Again, Franciscan drama. Francis had this great gift for making the gospel come alive for ordinary, uneducated people. A lot of them couldn't read, but they could follow what they saw Francis do. So they celebrated Mass at midnight. Francis was the deacon, and he sang the Gospel of the Nativity. And some of those there said that they saw the Bambino come alive in Francis' arms, just as he had brought Christ to life in the hearts of so many who had forgotten him. Should I be coming to an end now, Right. It's not the end of the story, but perhaps it's a good place to stop. If anybody's got any comments or quick questions or two.
If you do have anything to ask or to say, please wait for me to bring the microphone, otherwise nobody else will hear you.
Stunned into silence.
Could you...
Where the funding came from, if they were poor and written the maths were their property and their clothing and their food, is it in money?
Yes. Well, yes, to a point, but Francis was very anxious that the brothers should work with their own hands. Francis has been known as a mendicant order, but actually that is not strictly speaking true, because originally Francis said that the friars had to work, they had to help people, they had to help with the harvest, they had to nurse the lepers, they had to nurse the sick. It was only if they couldn't earn enough by the work of their hands that they would go out and beg. But they were very much dependent on the generosity of people. He wouldn't have them touch money, but in goods, yes, that's right.
Thank you for your presentation. Francis is often depicted as talking to birds and other animals. You portray him in society. Could you say a few words about that aspect?
Yes, certainly. I think this is a picture that we all have. You know, Francis preaching to the birds, Francis loving the lambs, Francis converting the wolf. That he was a bit of a nature mystic, like hugging trees and talking to flowers. There is that side to Francis, yes. But Francis was also very much a son of the church. When we used to sing the office in Latin, the beginning of Vespers on his feast day began Franciscus Vir Catholicus et Totus Apostolicus. Francis, that holy Catholic and apostolic man. In some ways, he had his feet very firmly on the ground, particularly with anything to do with the church. I say he was there at the Lateran Council in 1215, which was the equivalent of Vatican II. He wanted to know what was going on in the church, and he hot-footed it back to Assisi, and he told Clare what he'd heard, what he'd seen. The fruits of that are in the rule that he wrote for the friars. They're in the rule that she wrote for the sisters. So, yes, he knew what was going on in the world and in the church. But at the same time, he was somebody who could see Christ everywhere and in everything. According to Francis' vision, everything in this world is good and holy because of the incarnation. First of all, because it's been created by God. And then because Christ became man and walked amongst us. You know, the big question, theological question of the Middle Ages, why did God become man? Cur Deus homo. And the Dominicans said he became man to redeem us because of Adam's sin. And the Franciscans said, no, Christ would still have become man even if Adam hadn't sinned, as the crown of a good and holy creation. That the world was created with the incarnation in view, and that would have been very much Francis's attitude. Everything that he saw, when he picked up worms off the path, it was partly so that worms wouldn't be trodden on, but it was also because in Scripture it says, as if it's from the lips of Christ, I am a worm and no man. So whatever he saw, he put a Christological interpretation onto it. So everything is good and holy. Does that answer the question?
I'm not sure. It's a very, very good one.
I was just curious, Sister, in one of the depictions of Francis on the frescoes, he had this martyr his hands. Can you tell us about that?
Sorry?
The stigmata.
Oh yes, that's the next chapter in the story. Francis had been given a mountain as a kind of retreat, and he used to go there for times of prayer and solitude. And he was there towards the end of his life, fasting in preparation for the feast of St. Michael, for whom he had a great devotion. And while he was there at prayer, it's a very mysterious event. About the actual event itself, we know very little. But he did tell the brothers that he had a vision of a seraph. And the seraph was wounded in its hands and feet and side. And when he saw that seraph, when he came back to reality after this vision, he himself had wounds, hands and feet and side. There's no question about the reality of those wounds, because far too many people saw them and witnessed them. But again, this is an area where there's a great deal of research going on at the moment. Was this a purely supernatural experience? Or could it have been that in some way or other they were the result of some of the illness that Francis had suffered, the possibility that he had contracted leprosy, and that these wounds, I'm not trying to demythologize Francis. When I first heard that, I thought, oh dear, I'm not too sure about this. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought was God asking Francis to become what he himself feared and hated most of all. So that he bore the wounds of Christ, yes, but they were also the wounds of leprosy in his own flesh. Now, we don't know the answer to that, and we probably never will know. There's still a very strong possibility that it was supernatural, but it's an area where there's a lot of discussion going. Does that answer the question?
The battery is just going. I'm sure we'll have a year where it's more about the incarnational theology in this series, and also the stigmata, which is the mystical side of analysis. But for now, we understand it's half past. I'd like to thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry, even though it's a wonderful day, I'm sorry it was so light, because you couldn't see some of the clips. However, it was a very, very good presentation. Thank you very much indeed.